Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation on enhanced multi-tenancy features in IBM Cognos 10.2. My name is John Antonucci. I'm a Senior Business Development Manager at LTA Systems. I'm joined today by Rich Chester, our Director of Consulting, and also our featured speaker today. Hi, everybody. This webinar is one in a series of webinars that LTA is hosting for its ASL client community. We will be recording this presentation today for rebroadcast. Some of the ground rules for today's presentation, if you do have questions, please submit them using the chat button, and at the end of the presentation and demonstration, we will attempt to answer as many as time permits. The topic of enhanced multi-tenancy is an interesting one, and enhanced multi-tenancy is just one of many new features that IBM has introduced into Cognos 10.2 that are of specific interest to ASL partners. Today's presentation will do a deep dive in some of these topics and the value of multi-tenancy in your solution. And Rich will also be providing a demo as well of some of the features. Before we begin with the presentation, a little introduction on LPA and some other messages. I'd like to give a little introduction to LPA. For those of you who do not know us, and many of you on the call are existing clients of ours, we were founded in 2002 and have been an IBM Cognos partner since 2002. In addition to working with end-user clients throughout North America, we've developed a unique specialty practice around IBM ASL partner enablement. And we work with the IBM ASL team as a strategic implementation partner. Over the last 6 years, we have worked with approximately 50 IBM ASL partners to help integrate Cognos into their industry software solutions. We have a deep relationship with IBM that consists of being a premier business analytics partner. We do work with Cognos, with the financial performance management solution TM1, with Cognos Express, and also with SPSS. We are pretty much an IBM Cognos-focused BI consultancy. We do have skill in other areas, but this is our formal relationship, and we really put all of the wood behind this arrow. In addition, we also work with the IBM professional services team, and we are considered a core subcontract partner, one of about 8 to 10 companies that IBM comes to when they need additional resources. And finally, we're a member of the IBM Cognos Partner Advisory Board, one of about 30 companies worldwide that provides input to IBM on a variety of topics that are important to partners. We have an extensive background in IBM Cognos that goes all the way back to the Series 7 product. Our consultants are deep and tenured with an average of about 10 years of experience delivering business intelligence solutions in Cognos and in other areas. We also work as a professional services partner for many of you on the call today, where we help deliver your solution and the Cognos pieces to your end-user clients. Our goal in every engagement with an ASL partner is really to teach you how to own and operate your solution. So we are committed to your success and to your self-sufficiency in operating your solution that contains Cognos. This colorful and complicated slide really represents the world of ASL partners that embed analytics or reporting into their industry software solution. I'm not going to go into it in great depth other than to say that at any given time, an ASL partner is designing, building, implementing, supporting, or going to market with a solution. And LPA really can help with a variety of services at every step in the software development lifecycle. So our approach is to work with you around the complete development lifecycle if you need that kind of assistance, or we can work with you discreetly in different areas to provide an infusion of talent in design, in building out content, in developing custom security provider implementations, to help with multi-tenanted modeling, or to help you deliver your solution to your customers and support and train those customers as well. So we can help you in a variety of different areas, and for many of you on the call today, we work with you, to provide an infusion of talent and to help your team build skills and competencies and learn proven practices for implementing Cognos in your solution. So So our value proposition, which I think I've really hit, is we have significant experience in helping dozens and dozens of Cognos OEM partners really to get them to market more quickly and to be more successful once they get there. We're really familiar with many of the special challenges faced by the ASL community, a variety of different deployment models, whether they be on-premise, increasingly on demand, and some that have hybrid delivery models. Things like Custom Security Provider, Multi-Tenancy, rebranding, and doing integration and automation tasks, building those into Cognos, and basically getting Cognos to do what it does not do naturally out of the box. So you can really benefit from the experience and the different approaches that we've seen with several dozen clients over a 6-year period. Our consultants are high impact. They have a breadth and depth of product and industry knowledge, and many have done deep development work for ASL partners as well. I think most importantly, we have a flexible and phased implementation approach, so we can work with you up front to understand the entire project, and then we can work and develop a plan to achieve it, and then we can assist you and mentor you as you build out the solution and gain experience. Throughout the process, we work closely with the IBM ASL team, and we'll involve them in activities and throughout the project to ensure your success. We have a variety of quick start offerings that we can offer to ASL partners, things like environment reviews to troubleshoot and diagnose problems and remediate those. We can help you get to market with a Cognos 10.2 implementation if you need to upgrade from an older version. We offer a variety of training packages, many of which can be delivered on site with your specific data, which offers a high impact training experience. And we can work with you on data integration and modeling problems and challenges as well. We also offer an advisory service to help plan out your implementation. So if you're looking for assistance in any of these areas, we have some specific offerings that can be brought to bear on your situation. Last but not least, I want to provide a commercial endorsement for the upcoming Information on Demand conference, which will be held this year in Las Vegas from November 3rd through 7th. Many partners represented on the call today will be present at this event. I also want to mention that the Partner Summit this year is going to be one day. That is November 2nd. It's a real high-impact event that will offer a variety of technical and business tracks that are important for your business. LPA will, in fact, be providing a presentation on proven practices to implement Cognos in industry software solutions, and we will be inviting everyone on the call to that. And last but not least, we have a customer appreciation event that we will be holding on November 4th from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Border Grill, and everyone on today's call will receive an invitation to that as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rich Chester, LPA's Director of Consulting and my partner in helping ASL partners be successful in implementing Cognos solutions. Rich?
Thanks, John. Good day, everybody. It's my pleasure to walk you through our presentation on the enhanced multi-tenancy features available in Cognos 10.2 and beyond. The agenda for this session is what exactly is a multi-tenant implementation. And when you decide you want one, how do you specify tenant properties? What's the Cognos configuration that you need to do to turn multi-tenancy on, because by default it is off? How you communicate the tenant ID of any individual logging in to Cognos so that the security that you will create that is around a specific tenant's access to objects in the Cognos connection will fire appropriately based on who logged in. We'll look at that object security and how you set it. We'll look at how you administer tenants from the point of view of onboarding a tenant, setting, say, a default profile, and so on. And then I'm going to do a demonstration on a VM I've got running where I have enabled multi-tenancy using an LDAP to communicate login, usernames, passwords, and tenant IDs. I'll show you that setup. We'll onboard a new tenant. We'll look at some security things. And then if there's time, we will take some questions and possibly provide some answers at the end to try to get you as much information today as we can. Any questions that you do submit, we will respond to after the session. We'll send out a Q&A sheet. So any questions that we don't get to that you do submit through the chat feature in WebEx will be part of our Q&A response when we email you after this session. So, first of all, what is a multi-tenant implementation in Cognos? Cognos has been able to do multi-tenancy for quite some time. In the Cognos 8 days and in the early 10 days, you would implement security to isolate objects from one of your tenants to another using group and role security on an object. What the multi-tenancy enhancement is a new property that's been added to all of the objects in the Cognos connection. So when I have a single instance of Cognos that serves multiple client organizations, so everybody's hitting the same URL, getting the same login page, but when they log in, the objects that they can see in the shared content store for that instance are isolated to one tenant or another, or may be shared. So you have one Cognos connection. In our picture, we have 3 tenants. One of them logs in. In that shared content store, there is shared information, public objects, like maybe a folder full of shared reports that every tenant gets, and likely no tenant can change, but are the out of the box, every tenant gets this reports or dashboards or workspaces. And then they can also optionally have content that is specific to their tenant ID. So when tenant 1 logs in, they see the public data plus whatever objects have been associated with that tenant. When tenant 2 logs in, they only see their objects plus the public content and can never see tenant 1 or tenant 3's objects, and so on. Now, from a data sourcing perspective, you may have a data source per tenant, or you might have commingled data. That's actually independent of the tenant security and the IBM Cognos connection part. The multi-tenancy, the tenant ID notion, is a property on every object in the Cognos connection. It's also passed through to a framework manager model, so you can do security for the logged in tenant using the tenant ID attribute, if that makes sense. So if you do have commingled data, you might be able to use the tenant ID that you use to control security in the Cognos connection to also control access to rows of data or tables of data in your commingled data source. But by no means do you have to have a commingled data source. However, in a multi-tenant environment, you absolutely will have a commingled content store. And it is the notion of a tenant ID that helps us separate content and isolate it to one tenant or another. This new property is available on every property sheet. It's on the General tab. In the picture below, you'll see that the object that I've opened, which is a folder called Business Reports. This folder is specific to the tenant known as Boston in this environment. So no other tenant who logs in will be able to see this folder or its content. Had the tenant ID that's shown on the picture said none, then this folder would have been a public folder, and every tenant who logs in would have access to this folder and would be able to do something with it. Now, what can they do in this folder? Do they have the permissions to modify the folder, traverse the folder, execute contents of the folder? None of that has changed. The tenant ID doesn't override that, nor do you use the tenant ID to specify that. That's still done on the permissions tab with groups and roles. What I'm talking about is access to an object, yes or no. That's what the tenant ID is going to control. 0 or 1 tenant can be specified on an object. So when I specify a tenant ID, it's a pick 1. So none or 1. There's no, this object is shared by 2 tenants notion here. It's going to be shared by 2 or more tenants, then it would be considered public. And you would have to control it to be just 2 tenants and not all 10, let's say, in your environment by using group and role security on the permissions tab. When I place a tenant ID on a container, like a folder or a package, all of the objects in that container will inherit the tenant ID, and I can't override it. So I can't set a folder to a tenant of Boston and a report in that folder to a tenant of Rochester. That's not supported. Once I set a tenant ID on a folder, all of the contents of that folder are associated with that tenant ID, and I can't override it below the level of that container. Now, in order to enable that tenant ID property, which won't show up unless it's enabled in the Cognos configuration, I have to configure the security provider components of the Cognos configuration to be turned on for multi-tenancy. There are three ways to establish a multi-tenancy configuration in the Cognos configuration, and we'll talk about each of the three ways. And they all have to do with how Cognos gets the tenant ID of the logged in user. So you open up Cognos configuration, you go to the advanced properties, either of the individual authentication sources or the entire authentication tree, which means that you're going to have one configuration for all authentication sources that either is supported. The examples I'm going to show are going to be at the authentication source level. You specify in the advanced properties exactly how the tenant ID will be supplied at login. One of three configurations are available. And you start. Cognos will launch. It'll actually say in the messages when you launch within the Cognos configuration that multi-tenancy is enabled. And at that point, when you go into Cognos, you will be able to set the tenant ID property on all of the objects in the Cognos configuration. So what are the options to tell Cognos, get your tenant ID for the logged in user from here? Well, the first one is to use the ancestor hierarchy. So when I authenticate against an LDAP or an Active Directory, or when I write a Custom Authentication Provider for my users to authenticate against, one of the objects that is created at login time is called the ancestor hierarchy. It's an array. It starts at element 0 and goes up. And depending on what you're logging into, whether it's an LDAP Microsoft 1 or an Active Directory from Microsoft, or whether it's a CAP, what is in each array element could vary. The example that I'm showing there is one for the Sun 1 LDAP. The first element is the directory node, the second element is the namespace, and the third element is the organizational unit, which in this example that I've shown below, this multi-tenant pattern, where I told it to use the second level of the ancestor array and the elements in that level called default name. And that would give me the OU name in the case of an LDAP. And it's the OU name in how I've organized users within the LDAP that I would use to differentiate tenant 1 from tenant 2, tenant 3. So that's one of my options, is to use an array element in the ancestor array. And if I have a custom authentication provider, I'm creating that array in the Java code. And so I could simply reserve one element of the array in the CAP to be where I will plot the tenant ID for every logged in user, and I can configure in this way with my CAP. Option 1. Option 2, we're going to take a parameter or a property in your authentication provider that is part of the account object that is also created whenever a user logs in, and drop the tenant ID into one of those properties, and then map that property from your authentication provider to Cognos. So let's take an LDAP or an Active Directory user. LDAP and Active Directory are themselves a database, and they have a bunch of columns that we can fill in. We often think of the username and the password as the elements that are part of our authentication provider, but as it turns out, in Active Directory and in, say, Sun 1, there are 50 and more individual elements that are mapped into a user. So I create Rich Chester, I create a password, I create his email, I create his full name, I create his surname, I indicate what department he is, I indicate his locality. All of those attributes that are part of that LDAP can be mapped to Cognos and used to be to hold the tenant ID that makes every logged in user different. An example I'm going to show you in my virtual machine. This is the option I'm using. So I'm going to map locality from my Sun 1 LDAP to Cognos, and all of the different values in locality will be the tenant IDs that are part of my implementation. Every user will have a tenant ID. The users from the same tenant will have the same value in locality, and that's how Cognos will know what tenant you are when you log in. And you'll see in my configuration that I've used this multi-tenancy pattern called tilde parameter / and then a parameter name. And additional user properties to query parameters, that plus our map locality, which, by the way, the internal name for locality in the Sun 1 LDAP is L, lowercase l specifically. I'll map that to the same name that I referenced in my tilde parameter entry up here, and because these are named the same, L is going to map through and be my tenant ID for all logged in users for this authentication source. That's option 2. Option 3 is for when the ancestor array and the account object neither are suitable in your implementation to hold the tenant ID. This may be because the tenant ID comes from multiple sources. Maybe who logged in, I need to go and query another system and get the tenant ID from that other system, which is not something that it would be in my LDAP, and it's not something maybe that would be in my authentication source. But I have to go and add to the data from my authentication source to get the tenant ID. If I have to do something where the tenant ID is derived for a user when they log in, then I would probably need to use this option 3, which is to write a Java app using the Cognos SDK. And basically, Cognos will invoke the Java app every time someone logs in. It'll pass who's logging in, and this Java code will pass back what the tenant ID is of that logged in user as a string. So the account object from Cognos goes in, a string comes out, and then the value of that string is used as the tenant ID for the logging in user. Now, this is a separate Java program from your CAP. So your CAP is all about integrating your authentication source to Cognos. So your username and passwords in your app are the same usernames and passwords that Cognos uses. This would be used if after that account object is created from the CAP, I need to go elsewhere to get the tenant ID. Then I would use this option 3. If I don't need to go elsewhere, then I would simply, in my CAP, use option 1 or 2 and populate either the account object or the ancestor array with a tenant ID. So this is when neither of those work. This is you can do everything else by writing code option. Again, you can set these options either globally, and that would be done at the authentication part of the security tree, or on an individual basis for each of the authentication providers in your system. If you set it at the authentication level, all of the providers will inherit it. You can override it on individual providers by setting those properties on those individual providers that need the override. Now, you've done that, you've restarted Cognos. Cognos will tell you in the messages multi-tenancy has been enabled. When you log in to Cognos, you will now have this tenant ID property on all of the objects. And when I say all the objects, I truly mean all of the objects. So it's not just folders and reports or report views and packages. It's also on data sources or on data source sign-ons, which I think is a very powerful thing, actually, to be able to have a public data source and a private data source connection and maybe private data source sign-ons by tenant. But the notion here is that anything where tenant ID is non-public content, anything where tenant ID is other than non-private content to the specified tenant. Okay? And again, if I put it on a container like a folder or a package, and by the way, a data source is a container that contains connection strings and sign-ons, once I apply it at that level, I cannot override it within that container. Now, after you apply tenant IDs to items, remember the system administrators can see all content always. So there's no such notion as, all right, I'll give a tenant system administrator rights, because then you have violated tenancy protection, because any system administrator will see all objects for across the board, whether they're set to a tenant ID or not. So your system administrator is going to be an internal person. That's not going to be one of your tenants. And they not only can see all objects, but they can also set the tenant ID property on all objects. Once a tenant ID is set on an object, children of the object, again, that'll be the third time I've said it, cannot be overridden. Users have the potential to see all public objects, plus all of the objects associated with a tenant ID. And the reason I say the potential is because the tenant part of security lets you see public objects and objects with your tenant ID. However, on top of that, we have the permissions tab. And the permissions tab may restrict certain users of a tenant from seeing or doing things with an object. So we haven't lost any of the permission controls we've already had. We instead use the tenant ID to go to sort of a global object level. Can they see it or can't they? And then once we have the global part done, then the permissions tab applies as to what can they do if they can, can they read it, can they execute, can they traverse, can they set policy. So we have both options now with this multi-tenancy enabled, which gives us a whole bunch of power. And this notion of tenant ID, right, that's auditable. When you log in, We know who tenant you are part of. When you run a report, we know what tenant ran that report. So it's that higher level object gives us a lot more control over multi-tenancy than we had when all we had before was the permissions tab. So that's the value prop of the tenant ID. It's the tenant ID is in addition to all of the flexibility we have on the permissions tabs on objects. In addition to all of that, I mentioned earlier when I create a framework model, I have the option of using the tenant ID that's been mapped, which is mapped as a session parameter, in let's say a security filter. So I could, if my data in my commingled database, let's suppose, on each row has the tenant who owns that row of data on it, I could add a filter to all of my query subjects that say where tenant ID equals the session parameter tenant ID. And by doing so, I can have a commingled database be restricted from a row-by-row perspective by the logged in tenant, in addition to all the objects in the Cognos connection restricted that way. Not a requirement I do this. It is absolutely not a requirement that I have commingled data just because I have a commingled content store and Cognos connection. They are two separate considerations, and I can mix and match commingling on the data side while still maintaining a commingled Cognos connection with a multi-tenant environment. Now, to manage all of this, introduced in 10.2.1 is a new tab on the Cognos administration screens on the Cognos connection called Multi-Tenancy. In here, I onboard new tenants, and I can set properties relative to default user profiles. I can also export or import later content for a tenant. So I can delete a tenant, which is would be a big deal. That would disable them forever logging in this environment again. But I can temporarily disable and then re-enable that user from being able to log in, or that tenant from being able to log in. I might do that because I want to deploy new content and I don't want them to see half-deployed stuff. So I might disable a content from logging in while I'm deploying their new content. I might also terminate their sessions at the same time, so that way anybody logged in is not logged in anymore. So I'm absolutely certain that there's nobody looking while I'm deploying. Terminate sessions for a particular tenant I might use for any number of reasons, but I think it's probably most closely in my mind associated with deployment of new stuff. So disable, enable, terminate sessions. The user profile stuff I mentioned, I'll actually demo that in the demo. Content utilization, how much room is my tenant picking up in my shared content store? Since I have a shared content store, right, if I have one tenant that is bloating my content store with a bunch of saved outputs, for example, this create content utilization info will create a file that will identify for this tenant what objects they own and how big they are. So I'll be able to understand how much room a tenant is taking up, and that may be why I would export this tenant to another environment. On the content administration, so under configuration, content administration, import, export, I can choose there to import or export tenant content. I can choose to export tenant 1 into a deployment archive, so I could import it into another organization, another content store. I can import one of those archives that is all about a specific tenant. I can choose to include or not include public content in that export, by the by. So this multi-tenancy tab gives me a place to onboard, add a new tenant, and then manage tenants' access to my environment, understand how much of the content store they're using up, and provide them with a default profile, which includes things like the skin they're using, the number of rows per page in the Cognos connection, whether they're using alternating backgrounds, what their default tabs are, what the order of those tabs are, all of that stuff, on a tenant-by-tenant basis in a single location. I'll show you this in the demo, which I'll do right now. So let me switch over to my virtual machine, and let me give you a backdrop for how it's configured. First of all, it's 10.2.1, and I have Sun1 LDAP configured as my authentication source for Cognos. And in my LDAP, I have 4 logins established. this login, Cognos, this is set up to be my Cognos administrator for my environment. So when I log in as Cognos, I am the admin. None of my other users are set up in Cognos as administrators. They're all individual users for the 3 tenants to whom I have sold access to this environment. So I have a Space Sprockets and a Cogswell Cogs customers who are up and running in my environment, and they're already configured in my environment on the Cognos connection, and the tenant ID has been applied to all of their objects and so on. So I can log in as Spacely or I can log in as Cogswell, and I will see shared components that are common to those 2 users, and I will also have private content to each of those users. I have just closed a deal with my new customer, Orbit Industries, and I have a user ID created here for my Orbit Industries. Now, let's take a look at how these users are set up. I have set up Spacely and Cogswell, where the locality field in my LDAP has a value of T1. So every user that I add from here on out that is part of the Spacely Sprockets organization would have a T1 in locality. Similarly, for Cogswell, I did my setup there, and I gave them T2. So these have to be unique by tenant, these values in locality, because I am using a parameter in the LDAP to hold my tenant ID. So Orbit, my new client, when I created this user, I had to specify a different value for that locality, because this is where Cognos gets the tenant ID from that I would apply to each of my objects in the Cognos connection for security. So my new Orbit guy is T3. So that's my setup on my LDAP side. So that's my user authentication world. Usernames, passwords, and a tenant ID setting in the locality field that is unique for each of these 3 users. Now, Cognos knows to look at that L field, that locality field, because of the configuration I did in the Cognos configuration. On my authentication provider entry that points to my Sun 1 LDAP, I created an entry under Advanced Properties. Multi-Tenancy.tenant pattern, this is option 2. Tilde parameters, / and then I use the placeholder called parameter name. And then additional user properties to query parameters. These are both required for option 2. Now, what parameter is being mapped? I don't do that here. Right? I give it a placeholder name called parameter name here. I can give that any name I want. I'm using parameter name. In fact, all of the documentation uses the words parameter name in it, but you can use any placeholder value you want. I have to map that placeholder to the property in the LDAP found in the custom properties field on the LDAP. So I have mapped to parameter name the field called L, which is the name of the locality field in the Sun 1 LDAP. So you need to know the internal name and capitalization actually matters here. A capital L wouldn't have worked. The name of the field is lowercase l. So I've mapped lowercase l to parameter name. I've mapped parameter name to be where Cognos will receive the tenant ID, which is what the multi-tenancy.tenant pattern is all about knowing. This is how I inform it that tenant IDs come from there. And that's why the tenant ID in the Sun 1 LDAP works, is because I've used this option. And that's how I'm set up for multi-tenancy. So let me log into Cognos. I'm first going to try to log into Orbit because they're not set up yet. And if I try to log into Orbit Industries, until they're set up, I will be unable to log in. So tenant 3 in my environment has not been onboarded, therefore they cannot log in until they're onboarded. The tenant has not been granted access to the system is the message here. And until such time as I have granted access to the system, they won't be able to log in. I'm going to log in as the system administrator so that I can onboard Orbit Industries. So you'll see here I have a folder called Spacely Sprockets, a folder called Cogswell Cogs, and they are set up to be private to those 2 tenants. I also have a folder called Shared. My shared folder has no tenant ID associated with it. Therefore, it is public content. And the access that Spacely, Cogswell, and others will have to it is solely controlled by the Permissions tab. And in this case, I have given everyone in the environment read, execute, and traverse, no write privileges. So everyone who logs into this environment will see the shared folder and will then read, execute, and traverse permissions on that folder. Let's compare that to Spacely Sprockets folder, which is supposed to be unique and isolated to one and only one tenant called Spacely Sprockets. So the tenant ID has been set to Spacely Sprockets. That means that this folder, as well as all of its contents, will be configured to Spacely Sprocket. And you'll notice here, it shows me the Spacely Sprocket. It doesn't give me a way to change it, because once I've set the container, in this case the folder, all of its children get it and I can't override them. Right? So here you'll see that I had the chance to either clear, which would make this a public folder. In my example, I would not do that. Or edit and apply this to a different tenant if I wanted to. And in this example, I'm not going to do that. You would examine Cogswell and you would see that Cogswell is also set up to just one tenant and it's not public. You probably guessed that I'm going to create a similar folder for Orbit Industries and apply some content to it, and you'd be right. Can't do that though until I've onboarded Orbit Industries as a tenant. And that's what I'm about to do now. So I'm going to go to the administration screen. I'm going to drop over to the Multi-Tenant tab, and I'm going to onboard Orbit Industries. So you'll see there's my two existing tenants in this environment. I'm going to add a third tenant. They're Orbit Industries, so their tenant ID in the LDAP is T3, as you saw, so I'm going to put that in there. Okay? So now they're added. Now, before you all got on the phone, I went ahead and I created a skin for Orbit Industries that has their logo on it and the fact that this is the LTA portal for Orbit Industries in the Cognos connections. I'm going to create a default user profile for my Orbit Industry guys, and I am going to preset a couple of things in preferences. For example, I am going to change the list view so they don't have to hit the page down button very much, go to alternating backgrounds, and the style is going to be Orbit Industries. So this is how they'll get the skin specifically that I've created for them. I won't make any other changes here at this point, but you probably saw that I can set portal tabs and all of those kinds of things. Basically the same stuff that I could do on the default user profile under configuration. Here I get to do one by tenant. Which is quite value-added in my opinion. I've onboarded this guy now. They don't have any content at this point. They don't have any content they can use. So I'm going to go ahead and create their content. So I'm going to go to the Cognos connection. I'm going to go into my baseline content folder, which we'll talk about the permissions on that in a moment. This customer content, this is what I'm going to copy and create for Orbit Industries. So I'm going to paste it up here. And I'm going to rename it. And I'm going to set the tenant ID on it to be Orbit Industries. Oh, you know what? Sometimes I've found that I have to log out to set the tenant ID and log back in after I've gone ahead and onboarded a tenant. So let me log off and log back in. And go ahead and do that tenant set. Perhaps, let me just make sure that I hit go when I did it. It's there, and let's check that I know the property, and I've set the tenant ID here, just the way it was supposed to. And, okay, well, let me give that another go. Tell you what, I believe I have a caching issue with my browser, so I am going to address that and go from there. There you go. Caching issue. Gotta love browsers. Okay, Orbit Industries is now the tenant for this folder, which means that the folder is private to Orbit Industries. And by virtue of me having done that setting, all of the contents of my Orbit Industries folder have inherited that setting. So there's nothing I have to actually do to make that happen. Now, let's talk about this guy. In my shared folder, I have a workspace. This is the one shared object everybody in my company gets when they buy the reporting and analytics from me. Everybody gets this marketing workspace from me, and it's pointing to reports that are shared. And all those reports and the packages for those reports actually live here in this LTA baseline content folder down here under models. Now, I don't want any users to see this folder, but they have to be able to access the folder to run the shared content. And indeed, to even run any of the reports in their individual folders, because I have one copy of my packages. It's a choice I made. That may not be the right choice for every implementation. Maybe you need to have packages and reports that are isolated by tenant. In my case, I'm not doing that. But I don't want them to see this folder. But it has to be public content in order for them to run my shared and access the packages that all of the reports under each of these tenant folders do. How did I do that? I did that by setting the permissions on this folder to traverse and traverse only, and changing the system.xml file on this Cognos implementation, and changing the definition of what is visible in the Cognos connection so that things that are traversed and only traverse are not visible. Now that's an important trick, I think, in the multi-tenancy world, is to understand that if I set traverse on something, like a folder, everyone will be able to get into the folder, will access the models within it and run them. Of course, they have to have execute privileges on them. But if I change the definition of visibility, they don't have to see the folder. Now, if I'm going to write a report, I can't do this. My authors would need visibility to this folder because they couldn't get to the models any other way. In my case, I don't let my end users write reports. My reports are all managed by me. This is why I said maybe this won't work for everybody to have the models centrally. But it does let me point out this thing. And also let me reiterate that this whole permissions thing that we're used to, we still do. It's still valuable to us. And it's actually very valuable in public content as well as within private content. But this is why this setup, everyone has traverse, and I changed the definition of visible so that traverse only is invisible to users, except, of course, the all-powerful administrator. That's why this works the way it does. Let me log off now and log on as my new Orbit user. So my Orbit industry person gets in. Now they should be skinned for Orbit, and, which they are, they should only see their folder and the shared folder. Now even though my content folder is a shared object, no tenant ID on it, because of that traverse trick I did with the invisibility, it's not here. They'll never see it. But when they run this shared object, because of that trick, the shared object will run. And it will render the reports on it, as well as all the other reports that they're running. And that's how I was able to do this shared stuff. So now my Orbit guys have their private folder for whatever they purchased from me in terms of access to all of the different modules that I'm selling. My friends at Spacely Sprockets, of course, they do too. And when they get on and look, see, they have shared, and they'll run the same workspace, and they also have their private content that is perhaps different, customized maybe for Spacely, as where the shared would not be, and they can't see the Cogswell Cogs or the Orbit Industries folders, and that is how multi-tenancy works on the Cognos connection. Very quickly, I will launch Framework Manager and show you the Framework Manager component of this. So I'll open up Great Outdoor Sales, and I'll just add a filter so I can show you the session parameters. Actually, you know what? I think it'd be actually more instructive if I sign in as my Orbit industry user, because then I'll be able to show you that tenant ID. So So I'm just going to go and add a filter to a query subject, simply because when I do that, I have access to the session parameters in macros tab, and the session parameters for this user are going to be listed here, and tenant ID is available, and if I drag tenant ID into my expression, you'll see that it resolves to T3. So if I wanted to have a filter on this query subject that was where tenant ID was the logged in tenants, you see, and my security filter would filter my data. Let's say this was commingled data, and I wanted to isolate just for the records for the logged in tenant. This would give me this is an option I have to be able to do that sort of security filter. So that's how the tenant flows through to the framework model. And that is my demonstration, including a view of how the browser caches information, and you have to get out and in sometimes. John, it's time to take some questions. Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you, Rich. Yeah, actually, there have been a number of questions that have been coming into the chat feature, and again, if you do have a question, please submit it via chat. So here's the first one. Is there a way to configure a different email server per tenant?
At the moment, no. Since the email server is specified at the Cognos configuration here in the notification section, there's no notion of a mail server by tenant baked into the Cognos connection.
Okay. Here's another one. Is it possible to share the content only to the 2 out of 3 tenants?
Yes, it is. So if I were logged in as the administrator, and you'll see that I have this shared folder, which right now is visible to all 3 tenants. If I wanted to isolate it to just 2 tenants, what I would do is, rather than have everyone have access to it, I would override this. I would add a group from my LDAP. In this case, I'll just add people. What I'll do is I'm going to make this available for Orbit and Spacely only. Cogs will not have access to this folder. And the way I'll do that is I will give just these users and take off everyone. And now, when Orbit logs in, they will have access to it. But when Cogswell logs in, they will not. So I'll show you that. So Orbit, they have that. And I log in as Cogswell. If I did it right, they will not. There you go.
Good. Here's another question. Can we use the multi-tenancy function for multiple business users in the same organization to share a single Cognos instance across all business users in the organization? This would be similar to having multiple clients for the same organization.
You certainly can. Now, there's no hierarchy notion here, right? I can't say that client 1, 2, and 3 have a parent of tenant 1. And do security at in a hierarchical fashion. But I can absolutely say that Department 1 is tenant 1, Department 2 is tenant 2. Use everything I've shown you to isolate objects so that objects are specific to a single department or would be shared by all departments. Absolutely a valid use case.
Okay, another question. In your example, the models were shared but were presumably relational. How would this work with an OLAP database, for example, Microsoft Analysis Services, where the data source connection is embedded in the package itself?
Fundamentally, it works exactly the same. It turns out that for OLAP data sources and relational data sources, the data sources themselves, the connections to those data sources are in the, am I on? No, let me get out of the administrator, are in the Cognos connection administration screens, and if I wanted to configure so that I had different connections by client or by tenant, what I would do is, let's say that in my configuration I have Great Outdoors Warehouse, which happens to be both DMR, which is OLAP, and relational. At this level, I would keep it public. But if I wanted at this level, which is my connection string level, to have a connection string for tenant 1, a connection string for tenant 2, then I would apply the tenant 1, tenant 2 here. When the administrator runs a report, he'll be asked which of the two connection strings to use. But when the tenant runs the report, since they only have access to one of the connection strings, they would connect to the right database or the right queue. So regardless of whether it's relational or whether it is OLAP, I can manage what cube or what database is being connected to by virtue of applying the tenant ID at the connection string layer of the data source and keeping the data source itself a public object.
Okay, thank you. There's lots of questions coming in. Here's another one. Is there a way to split the tenants to a separate content store when a tenant size becomes too large? Is there an export process?
Absolutely. So when I do a content administration activity and I do a new export, one of the things it'll let me do is it'll let me set what tenant I'm exporting. So I can export the entire thing, of course. I can export the tenant, one tenant, or I can export that tenant and any public content as well. So I can move like all the public content plus the content of one tenant to a deployment archive, which means I could then import it into a new environment and move the tenant to that new environment. So that's absolutely baked into the administration component.
Okay. Another question. When report output is saved, is it saved with a tenant ID?
Yes, the saved output is associated with the report that's produced it. That report is associated with a tenant ID, and so you would absolutely have a saved output on the tenant ID. Now, when you have a saved output on a shared object, right, then the tenant ID is also on that shared output. Now, I would say, though, there would be an unusual configuration where I would allow my users to save output on shared objects. However, that is a choice that you would make in your architecture. But since every object that I run and every output that I save inherits my security, it inherits my tenant ID as well. So even on a shared object, my saved output would not be visible to another tenant.
Okay. Another question. Similar to a user with multiple tenants, can you create a user with less than system admin rights, but not restricted by tenant ID?
Well, I can certainly create users that are not restricted by tenant ID, and those would be maybe my report developers or my analysts that work for me as opposed to my clients. If I create a user that has a tenant ID, and I give them one of the other administrators other than the system administrator, I can certainly do that. The problem there is I guess I haven't done an exhaustive matrix to understand which administrator levels in Cognos get what. And you may inadvertently, by giving any administrator access to a tenant user, give them visibility to objects they don't want. So I would simply not recommend that you ever give a client user any administrator rights from the point of view of the Cognos administrator roles. Now, that's not to say that you can't give one of them write access to a public folder and all of the other people will read access. That's totally different. I'm talking about the administrator roles in Cognos. I do not believe it would be a best practice in a multi-tenant environment to give any tenant user any administrator rights in Cognos.
Okay. Here's a question that's specific to use of a custom authentication provider. We are using a Java cat. How do we add the new tenant on board with tenant ID?
Well, in a nutshell, you have control over the account object and the ancestor array. So you might remember my options 1 and 2 in the slides were that you could either use the position in the ancestor hierarchy, one of the elements in this hierarchy, and use that to hold a tenant ID, or you create the account object in your cap, and you could use a parameter from, say, the account object from your cap. So you have both of those ways within your cap to drop the tenant ID into an element that you can map through the Cognos.
Okay. Next question. What if a user selects a shared folder to save? Does it still get a tenant ID?
every object created by a user will automatically be assigned that user's tenant ID when created. Cognos does that. It's not a thing you turn on and you turn off. Even if you create them in a public container. So in that shared folder and public folders that I had, if I had given write access to one of my tenants and they created an object there, public at the container level doesn't mean that you can't put a tenant ID on an object in that container. And that's exactly what would happen. So my shared folder, which has no tenant ID on it, if I gave write access to my Spacely Sprockets user, when they created an object there, it would get the Spacely Sprockets tenant ID automatically and would be a private object in that shared folder to Spacely Sprockets.
Okay, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, and if we don't get to your question, we will publish answers and provide you a link to the Q&A and the answers. So here's another question. If multiple tenants are utilizing a report in a shared model, is the run history and output history assigned to tenant ID? So the whole audit database has been configured to understand tenancy, and in fact all of the sample audit reports that come with Cognos now include prompting so you can isolate that report to a specific tenant. The notion here is that the tenant log in, and in the written Q&A I'll provide specific table names, but the notion here is when you log in, you know what tenant you are. We also know everything you've done, all the reports you've run, all the queries from those reports. They're all logged in the audit database, and so you can create reports out of the audit database that will be by tenant. So you can see what tenants are running what, how long those reports are taking, whether they're failing or not, when they log in, how long their sessions are. The whole audit database is now tenant aware. And I think that we're out of time, John. Yeah, I think we're going to need to table the rest of the questions and put those in the Q&A document. I'd like to summarize the meeting here today and thank everyone for their participation and for all of the great questions. We will be recording this session and make it available for rebroadcast. And again, we will be presenting a number of other topics specifically of interest to ASL partners. If you have any suggestions for topics that you would like to see covered, please get a hold of Rich or I. It's jantonucci@lpa.com or rchester@lpa.com, and we would be very happy to consider the topic for future broadcasts. So once again, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you on another LPA webinar. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.